And we are back with another episode of the Kyle Ansloan Show, and I am very excited about the show I have today. I know one guy who, anywhere the U.S. is going to war in the world or is planning an invasion, a takeover, a conquest, I bring it up with this guest, and he's like, "Oh, I've been there. I know the people. I speak the language." It's absolutely incredible. So, everybody, this is Columbia University professor Joe Terwilliger, first guest ever on the Kyle Ansloan Show, now returning. So, Joe, very excited to have you back. How have you been, and how's world traveling been?
That's great to see you, Kyle. It's been a while. Yeah, things have been busy as always. Just got back from 2 weeks in Finland and Sweden, my other home. And, everything started blowing up as soon as I went away, it seemed, right? Greenland, Venezuela, Korea, everything's going crazy these days. So it's certainly been interesting.
Well, Joe, you pretty much there just listed off what I want to cover with you today. Trump bats off on Greenland. Was Venezuela a success? And of course, what's going on the Korean Peninsula? Not getting a lot of attention, but something that maybe people thought there would be some progress with during the Trump administration. So I have this clip to play of Donald Trump talking about buying Greenland, and then I'm wondering what you think of his proposal.
That's why American presidents have sought to purchase Greenland for nearly 2 centuries. For 2 centuries, they've been trying to do it. They should have kept it after World War II, but they had a different president. That's all right. People think differently. Much more necessary now than it was at that time, however. In 2019, Denmark said that they would spend over $200 million to strengthen Greenland's defenses. But as you know, they spent less than 1% of that amount. 1%. There's no sign of Denmark there. And I say that with great respect for Denmark, whose people I love, whose leaders are very good. It's the United States alone that can protect this giant mass of land, this giant piece of ice, develop it and improve it and make it so that it's good for Europe and safe for Europe and good for us. And that's the reason seeking immediate negotiations to once again discuss the acquisition of Greenland by the United States, just as we have acquired many other territories throughout our history, as many of the European.
So, Joe, Trump has since backed off a little bit. There's been reporting that he came to an agreement with the NATO chief, which is interesting because you would think Denmark would have to be involved, that the U.S. would get sovereignty over select military bases around Greenland. So I just want to start off with, what do you make of the whole idea of the U.S. somehow military buying it or otherwise taking over Greenland?
Well, Trump is, as usual, tries to say something really extreme and then ask for 10 times more than you want and back down and hope you get something in the middle. Um, it's a bit, it was a very clumsy attempt to do this. I mean, the Greenlanders in Greenland don't like Denmark. They have a long history of abuse at the hands of the Danish, from forced sterilizations to other various things they were doing in the last half even of the 20th century. So there was no great love between Greenland and Denmark, but they're dependent on it. Now, every political party in Greenland wants ultimate independence, right? That's the real goal, but there's no way they can afford to do that right now because there's only 50,000 people or so in the whole island, right? And they don't really have any income. I mean, I've been to Nuuk, and it's largely housing projects, basically, like you see in an inner city in America, because the Danes basically relocated Greenlanders who were living traditional lifestyles in small settlements all over the island, and they relocated them to cities so it was easier for them to provide what they thought was important, which was, healthcare, shopping centers, and all those things that we care about in the West. But it led to a complete loss of the traditional life and basically destruction of the way they used to live. So we could have easily approached and promoted an independence movement in Greenland, which would have benefited every political party in Greenland wants independence. So ultimately, if we'd have come in and helped to subsidize that, it would have led to a better outcome, right? If you want anything that's different from the status quo. There's no reason, though, that the U.S. would need to own it anyway or to control it in any sense, because we have the right by treaties from after World War II, to put as many bases as we want there, to do whatever we want with the military stuff. And the Greenlanders would welcome our help in, accessing any natural resources that are there. I don't think it's economically viable to do so, given the location and the amount of effort involved with all the the ice and the conditions and everything like that. To me, it just seems like the real goal in the long term has to do with the Northwest Passage. It's all about global warming is coming. Greenland's ice is going to melt. There's going to be more access there. And ultimately, there's going to be shipping lanes opened, that people were looking for a long time in the past, for centuries. And that's finally going to happen once global warming goes so far that it's, basically opening the waterways in northern Canada, and Greenland's the gateway to that. So when Trump talks about the Russians and the Chinese, he's only really, I think, thinking about the Northwest Passage in terms of commerce and shipping. And he's also thinking about, missile defense, because he wants to put in something like his Iron Dome, and Greenland's going to have to house a lot of those missiles. And the Greenlanders aren't too keen on that either, because that suddenly makes them a target. Whereas now no one's going to bomb Greenland. There's nothing there that somebody's going to want to destroy in a case of war. But if they start putting all of our missile defense systems there and make that a critical part of it, then they become a target. So that's the main reason they're not too excited about that. Although the U.S. has the right to do it anyway without owning it. So, I think from Trump's perspective, it's partially that if we don't own it, then a future government could change their minds if they get independence or something and not let us keep our bases. So you want something like the British bases in Cyprus or Guantanamo, where even when, in Cuba, when the government changed, we still had Guantanamo Bay because we had prior agreements.
Well, and I mean, you could say what you want about prior agreements, but if the U.S. military is somewhere, then, there's one thing of asking the U.S. military to leave, but how are you actually going to force them out, right? Like, even if the Cuban government told the U.S. to leave Guantanamo Bay, what are they going to do about it? And their country will absolutely be annihilated if they, try to prevent it.
Of course. I'm just saying they rely on these legalisms because they pretend that it's about the rule of law and the international order. And, we all know that it's whoever has the most weapons makes the rules. It's not really about international law principles, but they like to have that as cover.
Sure, although Trump seems a lot less interested in that than maybe some other leaders.
Well, he's admitting it's bullshit. That's the difference. He knows it's bullshit, and he doesn't even pretend it's real, right?
Right.
But, he wants cover, and you always don't want to look like you're being as wantonly aggressive as you are.
Well, one of the whole things about this Greenland play that doesn't necessarily make sense to me, Joe, is when Trump initially started this whole agitation towards taking Greenland, I thought Trump's main concern was Russia and China and felt like the territory was undefended. And the goal was actually to get the Europeans to defend Greenland, right? So they get scared of Trump saying they're going to take it over. And, the Brits and the French and the Danes and a whole bunch of other people, they all agreed to set up their own significant military presence on Greenland. And then Donald Trump could declare victory saying, I made Europe pay for Greenland's defense. But he didn't do that. He basically just reworded the 1951 treaty between Greenland and the United States. And look, I'm not somebody who really wants the NATO alliance to continue to exist, but look, there is a very healthy relationship between the US and Europe that exists, particularly on trade and other things. And, when Trump threatened this, the European countries, different, one of the Danish major retirement banking institutions was going to divest from the US dollar. So this seemed like Trump really gambled with hurting the American economy to change almost absolutely nothing. I mean, am I missing something here?
Well, I mean, on some level, he kind of wants NATO to not be there either, right? On some level, because I think that Trump's vision of the world is where, we control the Western Hemisphere and Russia and China get their regional control. That way we don't have to provide the defense for the whole world, and we can, save money that way by making them share the work. Well, that's at least the way they try to see this sort of thing. So I think on some level, he kind of doesn't mind if Europe starts thinking they have to take care of their own defense. Like Greenland's one of Greenland's leaders said a couple of days ago that to Europe, he said, Europe relying on the U.S. for defense is about as sensible as Europe was relying on Russia for energy. And we know where that got them, right? After they, decided they wanted to put the sanctions on Russia. Now they're the ones that are, in trouble. And so I think that that's part of what he wanted, right? Because he does want them to take care of themselves a little bit more.
So I do hope that's the case. I think that's one of the best case scenarios with Donald Trump. But recently he's been running around and posting on True Social the same line that the United States doesn't believe NATO would be there for the United States if the US needed NATO, but the US will be there for NATO. This seems like a golden opportunity for Trump to say, because we don't believe Europe would substantially assist the US if they were attacked, then we're going to question why we would assist Europe if they're attacked. So why don't you think he's, actually taking this all the way over the finish line and, just kind of making these provocations from time to time?
Well, I think that Europe's saying it themselves. I mean, the Danish leader said that exactly that we can't depend on them to defend us. The Finns are saying that they all want us involved, but they're all saying, well, Europe can defend itself. And Europe is starting to think that they have to develop some sort of an actual military force instead of really relying on us to take care of everything. And as Trump always says, it's like America is separated from most of our enemies by a big, beautiful ocean, right? And that makes our defense needs different from Europe's. And I think he's kind of trying to find a way on some level to get us out of the obligation to take care of them because he doesn't think they're pulling their weight. Now, in Greenland, of course, Europe did come to their defense, right? Finland sent 2 guys, and England sent 1, I mean, it's a little better than surrounding it with Legos, right?
So, again, I just wonder why Trump didn't pressure Europe to have a military buildup on Greenland. So, he could achieve the security results that he wants without the U.S. actually having to subsidize it. Now, this whole thing.
But I think that it's not. Europe doesn't care about that as much as the U.S. because what he wants on Greenland is not defense from Russian and Chinese ships. He wants to put in this missile defense system all across the Northeast Greenland, like national park area.
Well, he has repeated several times that he thinks Russia or China are going to take over the island and then they're going to be neighbors with the United States. So, I actually want your thoughts on that's where I was going to take it next is this even feasible in any way? Particularly like Russia, at least you could talk about, melting ice caps. And if you look at the globe from above, Greenland isn't that far from Russia, but it is fairly far from China and also maintaining a occupation of a territory that's an island that's at least somewhat far away from your homeland isn't necessarily like easy logistically. Like how would Russia supply? Like Kaliningrad is the Russian enclave there is completely dependent on like the Latvians allowing Russia to bring stuff through their country to get to Kaliningrad. So, this if it was a hostile takeover, that wouldn't be allowed. And it just doesn't seem feasible to me. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that that's just words. That doesn't mean, I don't think he believes that. I think, again, the issue with Russia and China is about the shipping lanes. He's concerned that Russia and China would get more control over access to the shipping lanes in the Arctic. And he wants to make sure that we somehow have that control over our hemisphere and all that sort of thing. So I really think the Russia and China thing's about that. Now Russia is one of the top 10 expat groups in Greenland, but it's still only like 100 people. So I don't think it's that big of a deal,
Right.
And I don't think there's any real military threat to take over Greenland, since our military is what is basically Greenland's military anyway, with our base up in the north in Pituffik. So I don't think that's a real issue. I think he's thinking about Russia shooting potentially long-range ICBMs at America that would go over Greenland, and using Greenland as a base to shoot them down. So I think that that's the issue with Russia, and the issues with Russia and China have to do with commerce through the Northwest Passage, since Russia controls the Northeast Passage.
Is that even a major concern anyways? I mean, we wouldn't say that we need to take over South Africa to control the shipping around southern Africa,
Hmm.
or something like that. I mean, it seems like once that is an international shipping lane, then it's an international shipping lane, and it doesn't necessarily matter whether Greenland is independent or under the control of Denmark or the United States.
Well, I mean, remember that the U.S. Virgin Islands were Danish, and we bought them from Denmark because we wanted them to help us control our asset in the Panama Canal. I mean, it was all about the shipping between the Atlantic and the Pacific. And I think a lot of this is long range thinking about the possibility that, much like Russia considers the Northeast Passage to be domestic waters, even though that's highly questionable, they're trying to work out some similar thing with Canada and Greenland, where they control it and they control access to it, so they could keep the Russian and Chinese ships from using it, or at least without a huge fee. So I think that there's issues related to that sort of international commerce, which is ironic because we go around the world, most of the places trying to open, freedom of shipping lanes and all that in the Straits of Hormuz and everywhere else. And now we're sort of trying to dominate them in the American Arctic, which is not going to be an issue for another 50 to 100 years, but I think he's thinking about it that way. And of course we all understand the big reason he wants to buy Greenland is because he wants to be famous and have that go down in history as what Trump brought to America.
Right, he wants his own, Louisiana Purchase,
Yeah.
right? Like, he wants, like, in all history books for everybody to, all the kids in school go, "Hey, why is part of the United States over there?" And all the teachers will explain, "Because the great President Donald Trump purchased this land to ensure the security of the United States and our prosperity, and it's been really great, and, oh, aren't we all better because of Donald Trump?" I think that has most, if not a lot, to do with this whole thing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's also like with Trump, that's a motivating factor for a million things. And it's sometimes a bad thing, as in this case, but sometimes it's a good thing because sometimes he'll try to make deals just to get famous, like he's trying to do was trying to do, at least in Korea and other places, right? Only reason he's interested is because he wants to be the guy that solved it, so he's remembered for something other than this stuff he's going to otherwise be remembered for.
Absolutely. So I have one more clip I want to play for you on the Greenland topic. This is Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent talking about why the U.S. maybe should take over Greenland.
Why is it necessary to take over and annex all of Greenland, something that 85% of people living in Greenland oppose?
Well, again, and let's look back. Denmark has a terrible history with Greenlanders. There was forced sterilizations up until the 80s or the 90s. So all of a sudden, now that the U.S. has expressed an interest, there is this new interest. And again, the United States needs to be in control to prevent a war, and that we do not want to get dragged into someone else's war.
So, Joe, I know that this is a topic that you're actually very familiar with. When Scott Bessent brought this up, I actually knew because of an article you wrote for antiwar.com last year that there had been some really horrific human rights violations committed by the Danish government against the native Greenlanders. So, I just wanted to kind of give you the platform because I don't think this is an aspect of this story that's really gotten a whole lot of coverage. Maybe just talk a little bit about some of those human rights abuses.
Sure. I mean, it's it's not anything different than the story everywhere in the world where the colonizers come in, the indigenous population suffers, right? In Greenland they had this episodes where they were forcibly inserting IUDs into young girls in Greenland without telling them, because they were trying to control the birth rates way back in like the 60s and 70s. They had other experiments they did where they took like a bunch of the brightest young children from Greenland and sent them to Denmark to be raised by Danish families so that they could become this superior ruling class of Inuits who could go back home then and rule like Danish people. Of course, they couldn't because they went back home. They couldn't speak the language. They had lost contact with everything, and they weren't seen as, people of that region. And, they also had a thing where there were a lot of children born with Danish fathers and Greenlandic mothers. Big surprise, happens everywhere in the world where there's colonial powers. And those children had no rights to the to anything from the fathers as a real. They were called the fatherless children. So there's a number of these sort of episodes where they did things, but I mean, it's not like any other country hasn't done those things as well in their colonial domains, which is why most people want to, because that's why most of the political parties in Greenland want ultimately to have sovereignty and independence, because they don't want to be ruled from outside. And I mean, had Trump approached it that way, like offering them money and all this stuff to help them become independent and become a free country, maybe join whatever is replacing after this USMCA thing and become part of North America, they would have loved that, right? Because the reason they can't get independence is because they don't have the money. It's not because they don't want it. And they certainly don't love the way they've been treated by the Danes. Just like, again, the Samis don't like the way they were treated by the Norwegians, or the American Indians don't like the way they were treated by the settlers. It's the same everywhere. So of course they don't want it. It was just handled in a very horrible way by Trump, just saying, I want to replace their colonization with ours, and we want you, and you want to belong to us. It's just like, that's not the way you do these sort of things if you want to win hearts and minds of the local population.
Right. I mean, and that's the last point is really important too. Just that, I didn't ask you to bring that up to like endorse, because Bessa is like the only one, the Trump administration, that seems to have like a real, like, he's probably read a book on Greenland at some point and has like some pretty good talking points on it, like actually that seem to reflect some understanding of the situation, where Trump is just like Russia and China are going to take it over. But the point here isn't that, oh, so the U.S. should have it because the Danish abused the Greenlanders. Is just a really important part of the whole story, and how these people have been treated for a very long time under Western colonization.
Yeah, they're not unique in that.
Yeah. So, Ness, I do want to ask you about Venezuela. Donald Trump kidnapped Maduro, left the government largely in place, and now he's seizing all these tankers in the Caribbean. What do you make it? Do you think this is going? I know you spent some amount of time in Venezuela. Do you think this is going to help the Venezuelan people?
Well, see, I've been running a project in Venezuela for the last 30 years. And we started in the 90s when Venezuela was a relatively rich country, despite the socialist system. They were fairly rich, because they have they've oil, they've got wonderful harbors there in Lake Maracaibo. They have some of the best beef in the world. The beef industry is amazing. The natural resources are just spectacular. They've got Caribbean beaches where there are no hurricanes in that part of the Caribbean. I mean, it should be the richest place in the Western Hemisphere. And basically, I watched it go from being a relatively prosperous country for Latin America to being absolutely the worst and the greatest refugee crisis in the Western Hemisphere, where, there's something like 15-20% of the population is left, and they're living all over Latin America and in other countries down there, and some have come here. So it's a real major problem, and it's certainly been pushed on by our policies, of course, against them. So it's a combination of a bad system, sanctions put in place against them, and just mismanagement at every level in the government there. I mean, I just watched it collapse. I saw it with my own eyes as things went from prosperity to crap. And, so I look at it and I can't imagine that it gets worse life for the people there because of this. I don't like it. Obviously, I'm not in favor of going around kidnapping the leader of a foreign country, especially the leader who has sovereign immunity. I mean, if we can do that, why can't, Putin could do it to Zelensky, or anybody in China could go and just kidnap the president of Taiwan and all this other stuff. It's setting up a precedent that is not good for us. Well, it's not a precedent. It's Noriega Part 2, right? But Noriega, at least technically, even according to Panama, wasn't head of state. He was, he had a different title or something. Here, we're just making stuff up by saying he's not a legitimate leader because we don't like him. I mean, meanwhile, we think Zelensky is a legitimate leader, even though his term ended like a year and a half ago or something, right? So there's all this hypocrisy that's setting the stage for major problems. But for the Venezuelan people, I just don't see how it can get worse, because it was so bad when I've been there that people are just doing anything they can to get out if they have a possibility. And we're still working there. So we're our project has been working with an indigenous community of about it's a community of about 5,000 people in near Maracaibo, and you know, we've kept things going for the last 30 years because it was a people to people exchange. It was done by people, not by government. This is the whole point of having interaction between normal people in our country and people in other countries, right? It's because it's not run by the government, so we could build trust with them, even though the people in our community actually liked Maduro. And they liked Maduro not because he did anything great for them, but because he made life worse for the rich people. So it got rid of some of the extreme income inequality and things like that in their minds. But it's certainly the case that it was absolutely about as bad as it could get there in what I've seen. And so I'm optimistic, and most of the people I know in Venezuela are reasonably, I mean, they're not too upset about this because it was so bad there already, and it has nowhere to go but up. And so if we're somehow building some sort of relationship with this new government, I don't really see the point of arresting the leader of a foreign country for drug charges. I mean, what authority do we have to indict the guy? It's absurd, right? On its face, just absurd. But again, for the people there, if we're now going to be starting to do something to remove sanctions, if they're going to start implementing some things, it's going to start revitalizing our ability to work with them and the ability of Venezuelan diaspora to do things back home, it might get better. It certainly can't get worse because it was so bad already.
Well, I mean, I do worry that it could get worse. I mean, you see some humanitarian situations around the world where things are worse than they are in Venezuela, although a lot of those countries are in like a state of war where it's not just that there's a lot of mismanagement and corruption, but the infrastructure has been destroyed on top of it. Now, for the economic situation in Venezuela, how much of the problem do you attribute to U.S. sanctions? I mean, if you look at the Middle East, for example, Iran is in the middle of an economic crisis. And again, their theocratic government has a lot of corruption in it, and they got problems based around there. But if you look around the other countries in the Middle East that aren't sanctioned, that are also theocratic, very corrupt governments like the Saudis, the Qataris, the Emiratis, they don't have the same economic problems that the Iranians have. So do you think at least a big portion of the Venezuelan economic problems are at least partially caused by U.S. sanctions?
Of course. I mean, I'm not going to be defending U.S. sanctions. I mean, come on. I mean, the U.S. sanctions policy, though, is becoming less and less effective everywhere in the world. Because as we discussed before, when you sanction everybody, you sanction nobody. I mean, we sanctioned Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, and now they're just trading with each other. And we complain to each of them about trading with each other, which is just nonsense, right? I mean, if you tell someone you can't buy anything, and you tell another guy they can't sell anything, of course, why wouldn't they sell it to each other? And, it's just common sense. Venezuela has the disadvantage of being located in our backyard, so they don't have easy access to be able to trade with China, Russia, and those other countries. Now, they should be able to, just like, it's absurd that we can, intercept like North Korean vessels and take them and steal them because they're trying to trade with Venezuela or Cuba or whoever else, but that's the way the game is played, right? Whoever has the weapons makes the rules. So yeah, the sanctions are bad, but the sanctions aren't going to explain away what happened in Venezuela, because a lot of that started even, there wasn't like all of a sudden we put in sanctions and the government collapsed. The government sort of collapsed because there was a lot of stuff about it that was really inefficient and wasn't making a lot of sense, and it wasn't working on the ground. So it's a combination of those things. The sanctions don't help, but the sanctions themselves don't destroy it. In Iran, for example, the sanctions were bad for Iran in some ways, but they were also good for Iran in other ways, because as a result of sanctions early on after the revolution, Iran had to stop being like a Gulf state that was basically a gas station that would, sell oil and buy stuff, right? They had to start building their own car industry and their own domestic industries for everything. And they did. And so they are relatively more self-sufficient than they would have been otherwise. And yeah, of course, the sanctions hurt. The sanctions prevent them from making the money they need to buy stuff internationally. It prevents them from buying, medical equipment and things like that they need to run a lot of their stuff. But in other, it's not the explanation for why it's so bad. It's just a part of it, and it isn't helpful. That's for sure. But
yeah, So, Joe, I can't not have you on my show and not talk to you about North Korea because, I mean, this is where you really know your stuff and where I think you are one of the real experts that we have on the planet on the situation. So, I was kind of just looking over the articles I wrote on North Korea, the Korea situation on the past year. There's a couple dozen. Most of them are, I think, in early September, late August, when they were holding the big annual war games. It seems the North Koreans are marginally more upset now than they were at the start of the Trump administration because we're doing the trilateral nuclear scenario preparations with Japan and South Korea. But other than that, doesn't seem to be a whole lot of development or movement to me. So, Joe, what do you think we could look forward to in 2026 when it comes to North Korea? Is there any potential that Trump and Kim, kind of rekindle their relationship and we have some more meetings and maybe a deal signed?
Well, look, the biggest thing about that's changed in the relationship with North Korea, there's two things. One is North Korea said we are no longer interested in unification with South Korea, which has kind of been obvious for like 30 years. But, the South Korean president at the time, the conservative Yoon Suk Yeol, he was saying that we want a unified South Korea to control the whole peninsula. And they called North Korea the number one enemy. And then Kim Jong-un responded saying, fine, we even take it out of our constitution that we want anything to do with South Korea. You're a separate country. And they started calling them by the South Korean name for South Korea in Korean, which they'd never done before. And basically, even the weather maps of Korea, now they only show the north on the TV. They don't show the south. And so they blew up basically statues and changed the names of streets and everything that had anything to do with unification. They even changed the national anthem, where the words in the national anthem referred to the entire peninsula, and they got rid of that. So it's a major shift, right? And that's a shift that should be positive because it should be indicating we are no threat to South Korea, which is kind of obvious anyway, but we don't want to take over. We want to be left alone, and we would like to have some kind of Cold War style peace on the peninsula, right? So that was a big change. Then what happened is that South Korea and Russia they formed this comprehensive strategic alliance in 2024. And what that meant was that aside from what we all talk about, which is the Mutual Defense Treaty through which the Koreans contributed to the war in Ukraine only by helping to repel the part where Ukraine had invaded Russia near Kursk and pushing them back to the border, because this was the Mutual Defense Agreement to protect each other's territory. And that's what we've all heard about. And that's actually kind of important that they stopped at the border and didn't continue to fight, because that's an indication that the Russians would interpret it the same way if there was a war in Korea, where they would just stop at the Korean border and honor the DMZ and respect the boundary that exists today, which I think is great for a future peace prospect. If we and the Russians agree that this is going to be the line and we'll each defend that line, that removes a lot of the problems. It becomes much like Cold War Europe, which, I mean, nobody liked Cold War Europe, but Cold War Europe, there was no danger of a war breaking out, right? But this comprehensive strategic alliance with Russia has extended to everything else. It includes education, science, technology transfer, trade, and most importantly, sanctions relief. So the North Koreans are now getting fuel and other things from the Russians, because why not? They basically said, this is getting ridiculous. We're going to sanction Russia and North Korea. Why wouldn't they trade with each other, right? So this is now the big thing that's changed in the game. So now Korea and Russia, by the way, in Russia, the domestic propaganda now is all about how North Korea is very normal. They're really trying to increase support for North Korea and Russia, which didn't have a lot of it before, because the Russians signed on to the UN sanctions against North Korea. The Russians abandoned them after the fall of the Soviet Union. So there was no great love for them and no great trust. And the Russians kind of laughed at them, like a lot of people in the world laugh at them, because the way North Korea is presented in the world media is a caricature of reality. It's not truth. It's a caricature of truth. And it's part of what you do anytime you're trying to soften up people for a potential war, like we did in Japan. We tried to make the Japanese seem less than human so that our soldiers could kill them, because it's not normal for humans to kill each other. So you have to make them seem like they're less human than average. So that's what's going on there. So, but now now they've got this thing where the Russians are starting to see them as normal. There's general interaction. The Russians have sent their rock stars over to North Korea to do concerts, which is the most interesting thing. If you see them, watch those on YouTube, because the most interesting thing is watching North Koreans that have never seen this kind of music, not really knowing quite how to react, but eventually getting into it as the thing went on. So the point is that now Russia and North Korea are kind of married in a way. And every other country is getting jealous. China was starting to worry about it's losing its influence. So it started engaging more with Russia, actually, and with North Korea, because it was like, wait a minute, North Korea is only talking about brotherhood with Russia and they're forgetting about China. So now China was trying to do more. And, Kim and Xi have met, not too long ago, and trying to rekindle it, so that the North Koreans are now like, yeah, Russia is our brother and China is good too, as opposed to them being on the outs with them. So this is all changing. So if there's going to be something that's going to happen, Russia's going to have to go along with it, right? And because North Korea doesn't want to lose all the benefits they're now getting from Russia, and to a lesser extent from China in terms of sanctions relief, trade, and normalization. And, I have friends who were in North Korea in October and in November on 2 different trips. And they both remarked at how the energy is so much better. There's fewer blackouts. There's enormous amounts of construction all the way out to the airport now, that somehow they're modernizing the economy and everything else, and that things are much better than they were the last time they'd been there, which was, long before COVID. So things are changing because of the relationship with Russia. So there's dependency there. So Putin has to be on board for anything good to happen. Now, I'm not saying that won't happen, but I think that a lot of the reason that Trump is pushing really hard on the Ukraine war is because they can't really do anything in Korea unless Russia's on board. And it would be a nice thing for Putin and Trump to do together, because it's in both of our interests to have stability on the peninsula. And again, getting some sort of East-West German style freeze along the border, where neither side is really afraid of anything happening to them. So I think that, Trump's problem with this is going to be he's going to be insisting on this denuclearization, but that ship has sailed. That's completely ridiculous now, because they have what they need. They've got Russian defending them, and they have a nuclear deterrent, and they'd be insane to give it up. I mean, Gaddafi gave his up, and look where he is, right? And so I just think that there's zero chance that that's negotiable. But there's a lot of things on the table where they could get something. And for North Korea's perspective, they're never going to have a better chance than Trump, because Trump is so desperate. Like when he was at the APEC meeting in Seoul, he was practically begging Kim Jong-un to meet him at the DMZ. And Kim just ignored him, right? And they're ignoring them because it's art of the deal. They're trumping Trump, they're doing it right back to him, and they know he wants it desperately because he wants a Nobel Prize, and getting a peace resolution in Korea would be something that he thinks will get it to him, and Kim knows that, and so he's obviously just stringing him along, waiting for an opportunity. Now, in the next couple of weeks, North Korea is having its 9th party Congress in its history. We don't know exactly when, but the preparations are heavily underway, and it looks like it's going to be pretty soon. And so there's been very little communication from North Koreans in the last month or 6 weeks or so, largely because they're expecting some major announcements at the Congress about policy and other things like that. And I noticed this morning on, I was watching North Korean television. They did a documentary about this former vice premier, Kang Suk-ju, and they showed pictures of him negotiating with Americans. So he was involved in the negotiations with Carter, with Clinton, Madeleine Albright, and they were all shown on TV. It would have been prime time in North Korea, like around 9:30 last night, which was, in the morning over here. And so, there's reasons to think maybe they're sending a message. Maybe there is going to be interest, because they've repeatedly said that Kim and Trump have a good relationship, and there's no problem with that. The problem is they don't trust America, because as soon as Trump's gone, the next guy can undo it. So, if Trump really wants to do something there, he's got to give them stuff that can't easily be reversed by our next president, because that's our history, right? Clinton had a deal with North Korea to give them light water reactors in exchange for shutting down their plutonium ones. Then Bush slow walked it. Bush made the deal with Gaddafi. Obama killed Gaddafi. Obama made the JCPOA with Iran. Trump killed that. Trump was dealing with North Korea, and Biden killed that. And that let Russia get basically everything it wanted there by building this alliance and getting the North Koreans to help fight in the war, and North Korea getting what it needed from Russia. So it's been a big mess all the way around, as usual. And they don't trust us. So we've got to give them stuff that we can't easily undo, like, for example, getting rid of the UN sanctions. Because if we want to reinstate them, we could put our own sanctions on anytime we want. But that's something that we can't reverse, because Russia and China would have a say if we got rid of those. There's things like, signing an end of war declaration that's meaningless, because Congress will never ratify anything if we signed a treaty, right? But at least you got the symbolism. You get things like this that you can do at very low cost. Like getting rid of UN sanctions is basically no cost, since Russia and China are ignoring them now, right? And why shouldn't they ignore them? So it's just like, give them these kind of things and maybe something can happen. So I would be very surprised if there isn't some kind of a meeting this year between them. There's all kinds of signals coming from the diplomats, coming from lots of people in North Korea and outside, that they're starting to think about these things happening. And I can imagine the Russians also need something to help improve their image, and being involved in something that leads to some kind of a peace treaty in North Korea would be good for them as well. So I have reasons to think something like that may happen.
Well, Joe, I hope that there are negotiations between the US and North Korea. You never know, because anytime Trump negotiates with anybody, he's always also making threats, right?
Yep.
So he could get the best deal possible. So, if they are preparing to talk, I hope they buckle up in Pyongyang and are prepared for the threats as well. Joe, thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge on the show today. You have so much understanding of so many different areas of the world. Not only are you a vital resource for me on this show, but also, I bounce ideas off you all the time. And it's also a lot of fun to talk to you about genetics. I tell a lot of people in the libertarian movement that you are the most underappreciated libertarian that we have. And everybody should really check out your work. I highly recommend it. So, Joe Terwilliger, you're neurobiology at Columbia University.
That's my title. I don't know anything about neurobiology, though. I'm a human genetics. I'm a human geneticist. Basically, just looking around the world for unusual populations to study. And they're all going to be in these places that are now the center of crisis. I almost feel like I'm causing the crises, because they happen everywhere I go.
Yeah, you're spreading something, Joe. Thank you so much for your time today. We'll do it again soon.
Great, thanks.